Thank you guys so much for logging on to listen to our webinar today, Healthy Relationships Now and Later. Today we're going to do a quick introduction. We've got an awesome guest from Counseling Services who's going to help us out with this webinar. We'll do a quick content warning, and then we'll move into discussing interpersonal violence by looking at different forms of relationships, the behaviors that we often see in interpersonal violence, and the specific forms of abuse. We'll move to talk about experiences and personal responses to abuse. Then we'll talk about tips for healthy relationships in current circumstances. And lastly, we'll talk about some additional resources you can utilize, whether you're experiencing interpersonal violence or someone you know is. Alrighty. Guidelines and contact knowledge. Mallory, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Like Liz said, thank you so much for logging on and listening to our webinar today. My name is Mallory, and I work in Counseling Services as the Mental Health and Wellness Educator and Outreach Coordinator.
Thank you so much, Mallory. As you guys know, my name is Liz, and I'm the coordinator of Sexual Assault, Interpersonal Violence Prevention, and Education, which is why I get to lead some of these fun webinars and ask other people to jump in with me. Just a really quick and important note that anytime we're talking about interpersonal violence, sexual violence, or abuse, we want you to understand that this is a difficult topic, and feel free to step away at any time. We'll have some resources that are provided in this video if you need additional help, but there's also resources that are available on our depaw.edu slide and our Instagrams that you can find. But remember that this is and can be a difficult topic, and you're more than willing and able to step away at any time. Alrighty, we're going to go ahead and get started. So when we're talking about interpersonal violence, it's really important to understand that this is something that's not talked about very frequently, unfortunately. However, it is something that happens quite frequently. So what we know is that 1 in 3 women will experience interpersonal violence in their lifetime. And 1 in 7 men will experience interpersonal violence in their lifetime, and more than 54% of transgender individuals will experience interpersonal violence in their lifetime. So if we're looking at just those statistics alone, we can see that this is a really big problem already, and the current circumstances surrounding COVID-19 have actually increased the amount of interpersonal violence related calls we've seen to police departments. And part of that is because of social distancing and people living with and being forced to stay in the same place as the person who commits this interpersonal violence against them. So what I've done is put a couple of the cities up that we've seen really big increases in interpersonal violence calls. So one of those is Dallas with 20.3% compared to last year in March. And Boston has seen a 22% increase in calls to their police departments related to interpersonal violence compared to last year. Chicago has also seen an increase. So we can see these numbers coming out of the big cities that are tracking it. But we can make a pretty good assumption that based on the numbers we're getting out of big cities, that police departments across the country are seeing increases in phone calls, which means we're probably seeing an even larger increase in interpersonal violence because not everyone makes that call. So we're going to go ahead and talk about what interpersonal violence is and how we can identify it. So interpersonal violence is defined by the World Health Organization as violence between individuals, which is then subdivided based on the relationship of the person committing the violence to the person experiencing the violence. So what we know is that when we're talking about interpersonal violence, there's kind of 2 different ways that it's subdivided before we really talk about the violence itself. So it's divided between community and then family and partner. When we're talking about community interpersonal violence, this is the interpersonal violence that's between friends or acquaintances, and then strangers is also something that can be discussed. We're going to focus on it more in terms of family and partner interpersonal violence, which is the other category. And this can come in the form of child, partner, or elder. Something else to note when we're talking about interpersonal violence in relationships is that, especially when we're talking about it in partners, interpersonal violence can happen whether those people are still together or not. And sometimes we see a lot of cases where it actually, more harm is done, and often death, unfortunately, happens after the relationship has ended. So we're really going to focus on partner and child today, especially within the current circumstances, because a lot of you as students are back home with your parents or your guardians and your families, and then some of you are living with your partners. Okay, so how do we think about interpersonal violence and healthy relationships versus unhealthy relationships versus abusive relationships? So what we know is that relationships are never going to be stagnant. It's going to be something that is moving around. It's more of a spectrum, which is why we have this awesome pyramid that we've created using information from the Domestic Violence Hotline that shows how we can understand the scale of behaviors related to relationships instead of just thinking about them as stagnant behaviors. So if we look at the bottom of the pyramid, we can see that it's green, and then it moves to being orange-red at the top. When we're talking about green, that's going to be our healthy relationship behaviors. And when we're talking about orange-red, we're talking about those abusive relationship behaviors. We've got those unhealthy relationship behaviors in the middle in yellow, but it's important to understand that when we're talking about unhealthy and abusive relationship behaviors, a lot of the behaviors are the same. It's just the intensity of the behavior that's going to change whether it's abusive or unhealthy. If we're thinking about it also in terms of relationships and the idea that relationships are not stagnant, we have to understand that because relationships are not stagnant, there could be a period in the relationship where there's abusive behaviors, but then the person who's experiencing that abusive behavior, there could be a moment where it drops down and it feels like it's healthy because they're having fun, or because something really positive has happened. So that's another reason that we have this arrow going up and down when we're talking about relationships, because relationships are never stagnant, they're always moving. And really healthy relationships may have unhealthy moments, so we can't completely separate everything, but we can talk about it in terms of behaviors so that we can identify those behaviors and help those experiencing interpersonal violence through these situations. So when we're talking about healthy relationship behaviors, we can see honesty, equality, a comfortable pace between the two people. That's really specific to romantic relationships. Trust, independence, responsibility, communication, respect, fun, healthy conflict is a really big one. And then we can see that we move to this yellow area where we start to see those unhealthy behaviors, such as ignoring boundaries, pressuring, disrespect, isolation, belittling, lying, unequal economic discussions. This is one that sometimes leads to a little bit of confusion, but it's that idea of someone talking about money in unequal terms and using disrespect and kind of guilt to say, well, like, you're not making as much money as me, so this is why you're going to do this, or things like that. And we're going to talk about that under forms of abuse in a little bit. Deflecting responsibility is another one. Volatility, possessiveness, guilting, betrayal, intensity, manipulation, and sabotage. So all of these things can appear in unhealthy and abusive relationships, but that doesn't mean they're all going to appear. So you may only see a few of them. You could see isolation and intensity and betrayal, and you may not see some of that volatility, and that doesn't mean it's not unhealthy and it's not abusive. So we're going to talk about forms of abuse next. So there's 5 different forms of abuse, but a lot of times when we are talking about interpersonal violence, a lot of people only think about emotional, physical, and sexual abuse. So we're going to focus on those first, then we're going to talk about the other 2 forms, which are just as prevalent and just as important. So when we're talking about physical abuse, this is just like what you think it would be. Hitting, slapping, punching. This is causing injury to someone else, and it's a physical form. We've got emotional psychological abuse, which is the idea of humiliation, intimidation, name calling, demoralization, isolation, manipulation, some of those key words that we see in our pyramid. And then we see sexual abuse, which is the idea of forced sexual activity or sexual assault. And in the last really 5 to 7 years, we've seen a huge increase in digital exploitation of sexual abuse, which is the idea of blackmailing someone based on having sexual images of them or forcing them to do something and then recording the video. So based on the technologies that have come into play, we're seeing digital sexual abuse becoming a larger and larger problem. Next, we have 2 other forms of abuse that are just as important to understand, especially when we're talking about parent-to-child interpersonal violence, because these are such significant factors in everyone's life. So financial abuse is the idea that you're limiting access to income or assets, restricting employment, or controlling the other person's finance. So an example of this, if we're talking about financial abuse, is limiting someone's ability to go to work, or specifically controlling their finances and not letting them control their own bank account. A really good example of this is when we're talking about elder abuse. If a parent moves in with their child and their child is controlling all their finances and doesn't let them have access to any money, and they have to ask permission to be able to have money, and oftentimes they're denied. The last form of abuse is property and ownership abuse. This is the idea of stealing or destroying belongings or money, and then refusing basic needs such as food or medical treatment. And this is even more important to understand because property and ownership abuse is the idea that basic needs are not being given to you, and which is a huge form of abuse that a lot of people don't think about. So if you need to do something in order to have a house over your head because the other person is going to kick you out if you don't do that item, that's a form of property and ownership abuse. Especially when we're talking about interpersonal violence, we've seen an increase in property and ownership abuse related to sexual abuse, so forced sexual activity in order to maintain a house over their head, or to have to pay rent, or to include it and be able to provide groceries for their family. So these are the forms of abuse, and we've talked about those behaviors that are related to it. But when we're talking about these forms of abuse, we have to look at our pyramid again and see that these forms of abuse come in many different forms, and that you could have physical abuse and emotional abuse happening at the same time if someone is causing someone pain and then deflecting responsibility. If you wouldn't have broken this dish, then I wouldn't be hitting you, would be an example of that. So when we're talking about forms of abuse and interpersonal violence, it's important to understand that we are going to see these intertwined, and almost every time, it's not just going to be one form of abuse that's happening in an interpersonal violence situation. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Mallory.